Welcome to Europe Explained, brought to you by the Council of Europe. This podcast series offers a unique window into what we are doing to create a fairer, more democratic Europe. Through conversations with experts and frontline workers, we bring you closer to the issues that matter, from fighting discrimination to upholding human rights, from defending democracy to building laws, systems and institutions that are just, fair and open to all.
Welcome to this new episode of Europe Explained, the Council of Europe's podcast that highlights the work on the Council of Human Rights, democracy and the rule of law. Today's episode is going to be on immigration detention. And to talk about this important topic, I've just been joined by representatives of the CPT, which is the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, of Inhuman and Degrading Treatment and Punishment. Alan Mitchell, hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. You are the president of the CPT, and Francesca Gordon, hello.
Good morning.
You are an advisor at the committee and a lawyer by background. Alan Mitchell, could you please start by explaining your work at the CPT in a few words, please?
Sure. The European Committee for the Prevention of Torture is an international treaty monitoring body. The European Convention on the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman and Degrading Treatment and Punishment was established over 35 years ago. Currently, the 46 member states of the Council of Europe are party to the Convention. The Convention establishes a committee which has a preventive monitoring mandate. That committee's work is to, where necessary, strengthen the protections afforded to persons who are deprived of their liberty. And these are persons in prisons, in police stations, in psychiatric hospitals in relation to involuntary patients, those in social care homes who are subject to guardianship orders, and those who are detained administratively in relation to immigration matters.
And so, Francesca, what are the CPT's standards regarding immigration?
So our committee has this powerful treaty-based mandate to enter all places of deprivation of liberty, including immigration detention places. And we use this primary evidence-based methodology to examine all different types of evidence, such as logbooks, CCTV footage, interviews, primary interviews with detainees, staff and doctors. And we form these conclusions as to whether the treatment for the detained person by staff is correct or not, and whether the conditions are degrading or not.
And so different states give you the authorizations to go in these detention centres?
Absolutely. So each of the 46 member states have entered into a convention called the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture. And within that convention is the right and the mandate for our monitoring body to enter at will to these detention places upon notification, often at very short notice.
And so what are the standards that you expect in these centres?
So the standards that we expect are base minimum standards, pillars of decency, like access to outside fresh air and exercise, adequate light, space, ventilation, basic food and water, access to communication with family, access to a doctor, access to a lawyer. And we're there, the teams witness and verify that these exist not only in theory, but also in practice. And the principles upon which they've been based are the fact that people crossing a state border in an irregular manner to reach safety and perhaps to flee persecution must not be qualified as criminals and administratively detained in a proper and correct manner. So facilities should be designed for that in mind. And the longer the detention may last, the better the living conditions and regime should be afforded to the detainees. So detainees can spend many months, if not up to several years, in these places. And we look to see that they've got the appropriate conditions and regime in place. And states need to take responsibility for those basic minimum conditions and treatment.
And in your different reports, Alan, have you noticed that these standards are possible, or do all these visits prove that it's very hard to maintain these standards?
I think it's incredibly variable. In recent years, the committee has had an increased focus on immigration matters and immigration detention, in particular, across Europe. Member states of the Council of Europe are not affected to the same extent. Countries at the borders of the European Union in particular, and I'm thinking about Greece, about Cyprus, Italy, Spain, Malta, Hungary. These countries have seen significant migrant flows. Countries will sometimes experience hundreds of persons per day, sometimes even thousands, crossing their borders. And the committee acknowledges that the practicalities of such can make it really difficult for member states to immediately provide accommodation that is in keeping with each of the CPT's standards. The convention in which our committee's work is based is focused in Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right not to be subject to torture, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. And it would be fair to say that in a number of our reports, we have seen situations that the committee have described as being inhuman and degrading. We have visited some police immigration facilities where the cells were so overcrowded that persons not only were they unable to lie down, they were unable to sit down. I recall one occasion visiting a police station, and there were so many migrants literally crammed into the cell that I had to ask the senior officer on duty to remove some of the migrants from the cell in order that I could enter the cell to see the conditions of detention and to talk with those people. So I think we see incredible variation across different member states, and also sometimes within member states. The conditions designed for longer-term detention of migrants, and as Francesca has referenced, detention of migrants is administrative detention. These people most often have not been accused of a criminal offence. And what we tend to see is that the initial reception facilities closest to the crossing points, as it were, they very often offer the least favourable conditions of detention, while those which are designed for longer stay, the conditions, generally speaking, tend to be a bit better because the population tends to be a bit more stable. But as a committee, we have long advocated that there is a need for a pan-European approach to the whole issue of how best Europe responds to migratory flows. And it cannot simply be left to those countries at the front line of Europe, as it were.
And when you do these visits, Francesca, do you feel the staff is happy to help you? Or, I mean, you were mentioning the fact that they're very short noticed sometimes. So are people happy to show you around? Or do you feel that sometimes your visits are quite complicated?
I think it depends on the country. Generally, there's not a systemic ill will towards needing to provide basic minimum standards of decency and treatment for foreign nationals. Those people choosing to work in detention centres are usually those people who care and are state officials who actually want to make a difference. So we're not finding states purposefully and manipulatively either hiding people or denying access. Our visits can last up to 2 weeks. We have a large delegation that splits into two often. We go round a country in two separate minibuses with our own interpreters. And we tend to do larger facilities by day, such as prisons or large immigration reception or removal centres. And the smaller places we can do at night, so a border police station, we could potentially do in the evening, or we have been known to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning, which is not popular with everyone, including the delegation.
And
but has to be done.
The current president.
Yeah, including yourself, maybe.
Absolutely.
The principle of deterrence and the sunshine principle is that a monitoring body can come at any point. And this is not necessarily to catch anyone red-handed, but it means that officers need to be aware that they can be held accountable at any point.
But how do you protect human rights, but also regulate borders? I mean, I'm sure you understand that different states have to regulate borders. So, I mean, is it challenging to maintain the right balance?
Every state has the right to protect their borders. And in the context of our work, whenever I visit a country for the purposes of a focus on immigration detention, in the talks that we as a committee have with the authorities, we at the outset make it very clear that we acknowledge the challenges of often unpredictable migratory flows, particularly in relation to numbers. However, the right to be free of the risk of being tortured or treated inhumanely or in a degrading way is an absolute right. Even in times of crisis, member states must protect that right as afforded to all persons whom are deprived of their liberty. I think in that regard, planning for migratory flows is key. And indeed, we have seen some examples of very good practice. We meet often staff who are incredibly well-intentioned, but they're simply overwhelmed at times. And, you know, I suppose the centre, if I recall, that I have visited most often is the Moria Centre in the island of Lesbos in Greece. And the first time I went to Moria, there were around 2,000 persons being accommodated there. On the most recent occasion when I went to Moria, and that was a few years ago now, just before COVID, I think, there were 10,000 people being accommodated there. When you design a facility for 2,000 people that then has to accommodate 10,000 people, of course that's going to increase tensions among the migrants, among the residents within that facility, but will also increase some tensions between the residents and the staff. But irrespective, if a state decides to administratively detain a person, then there are certain basic rights that are inviolable and must be afforded to them.
And which are the most vulnerable groups? You were talking about this island. Are your reports showing that it's always the same population that's the most vulnerable, or does it depend on the facility? Francesca?
These are mixed migratory flows. So within a boatload of people fleeing their countries, you can get children, unaccompanied children. You can get families with young infants, but primarily you get single male adults. So I would say about 3/4 of the people we meet are single male adults. And then 1/4 will be of mixed vulnerable protection needs. And those include people with visible protection needs, but also invisible protection needs. So people suffering or people with specific mental health or physical disability needs, victims of torture or trafficking, because we mustn't forget that they may have had an incredibly traumatic route to get to the point that we meet them. Unaccompanied minors, accompanied children with families, pregnant or breastfeeding women. And lots of these persons have arrived, and some have arrived traumatized, and we expect them to be screened for those vulnerabilities and protection needs upon the arrival to these massive reception and registration centres. Sometimes we see they are being identified, but often not. As Alan said, the massive strain and overcapacity on these centres means that not everyone gets identified quickly. And even if they are identified, they're not necessarily followed through with the referral and protection and specialist services that they need.
And in the EU, are there new laws being discussed to help prevent these situations, or ongoing negotiations that you've maybe mentioned in your reports too, or encouraged?
The EU Migration Pact continues to develop. A key part of that pact for the CPT is the establishment of independent monitoring mechanisms at the borders of the European Union. To date, Croatia has, I understand, established already an independent border monitoring mechanism. Other EU member states are in discussion with the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. The Committee for the Prevention of Torture is actively engaged in ongoing dialogue with the Fundamental Rights Agency. As a committee, we undertake 20 or around 20 visits per year to countries where we cover the whole gambit of settings of deprivation of liberty. We probably, on average, will have 4 or 5 visits each year, which have a focus on immigration detention. We, as the European preventive monitoring body, cannot possibly monitor all of the EU's external borders in our work. Therefore, it's vitally important that each of the member states of the European Union does establish a truly independent and effective border monitoring mechanism, which has the privileges that the CPT have. We have the right of access to any place of deprivation of liberty at any time. We are able to speak with anyone whom we wish to speak to, both staff and detainees, and we have full access to any materials that we think are necessary in order for us to carry out our monitoring work. And as such, we believe that the national independent border monitoring mechanisms to be established in each of the EU member states must have a similar scope of practice and similar powers, if I might use that word, to ourselves.
And so what are the CPT's standards on pushbacks, for example?
The CPT standards on any form of violence associated with so-called pushbacks, so-called forced returns, is absolutely in contravention with a person's rights not to be ill-treated. And pushbacks have been legalised in some EU member states. In such contexts, it's essential that if persons are forcibly returned at the borders, if they're pushed back, then there should never be violence associated with that. But equally so, all persons should be given the right in that country to which they have entered to seek international protection. There must be an individual risk assessment. All persons individually, it should be the right to seek protection should be facilitated, and in no cases should there be collective pushbacks, and certainly never collective violent pushbacks, because in our view that would be contradictory to the statutes of international law.
And do you feel that all your recommendations on pushbacks, but also the rest that we've been mentioning, have been heard? Do you have examples, positive examples of changes that you made possible, that your visits made possible? You were mentioning you have 20 visits a year. Do you feel, hopefully you feel that your work is being heard and making a difference? Do you have examples?
Absolutely. I spoke earlier in relation to the police facility that I entered, and I had to ask the senior officer to bring some of the detainees out of the cell in order that I could enter.
Which country was that?
That was in Greece. 2 years later, the committee went back to the same town, and we visited the police station again. And on that occasion, we were very happy to see that the facility that we had visited previously had been closed down. A new police facility had been opened, which was accommodating migrants at the time of our visit, but that facility offered conditions of detention which were much more favourable and were respecting of the rights of the detainees than had been the case in the previous facility. And also, it's important to note, whereby a facility offers decent living conditions for detainees, that's a facility that offers decent working conditions for staff. So it's a win-win in the committee's views. I mentioned earlier Croatia and the establishment in Croatia of independent border monitoring mechanisms. The committee visited Croatia most recently with a focus on immigration detention, I think, Francesca, it was 2020, and the committee were concerned as to a number of aspects of the pushbacks from Croatia into Bosnia-Herzegovina. Subsequent to our visit, we had intense and indeed productive dialogue with the Croatian authorities, where we engaged with them directly on the issues. And now Croatia is one of the first EU member states. And in fact, it is the first, as I understand, the first not only EU member state, but the first member of Schengen to establish an independent border monitoring mechanism.
And actually, as a follow-up to that, it's interesting that we get, recently we've had much fewer allegations of ill treatment and forcible pushbacks over that border since the creation of this independent border monitoring mechanism. So there is tangible change in terms of our own preventive mandate coming out of that. And maybe I can share one other example with you,
yes.
Which is Malta, quite concretely. We went in with a rapid reaction visit in 2020 during the height of COVID. And we arrived in Malta to find emergency army barracks being used to house the large influx of foreign nationals that have arrived or had arrived to the Maltese shores. And this one was called Lister Barracks, and it was used as a temporary solution, but it had stayed in practice. So you had to enter into the army base and then get to the army block, which didn't have army officers there. It had migrants. And it essentially only warehoused the persons detained there. There were hundreds of foreign nationals, very limited access to the outside exercise yard, very limited access to medical services. Staff found it hard to actually find the key to let us through the padlock to get to the persons to interview them.
Because there were too many people,
There were just so many, they were overwhelmed. And therefore, we wrote a very critical report of that that type of accommodation, which is the use of operational army barracks as a non-specific administrative detention place. And all credit to Malta, they closed the facility down, and since then, detainee numbers have really dramatically come down. From what we are aware, and when we last went back to Malta, that barracks was not operational anymore. There are other immigration detention facilities in Malta, but that one had been closed down.
Because you always come back when you've done a first visit, do you always come back to see if the changes have been made?
Yes, absolutely. It depends on periodic visits. We will come back 4 to 5 years later and really fact check to see whether anything's changed or not. But when there is a specific issue, we can come back on a targeted visit, really 18 months to 2 years later to check.
And so do you have any upcoming visits you can talk about, or is it confidential for now? I mean, what are your priorities in the coming years?
In relation, let me just follow on to what Francesca said in relation to the follow-up of visits, in particular in relation to follow-up of visits to immigration detention facilities. Recently, we were both in the Republic of Cyprus. Cyprus was a member of the Council of Europe that we visited most recently in 2023, May 20. We went in May 2023. The report on that May 2023 visit has already been published. It set out the committee's concerns, in particular in relation to the Purnara facility. 3 weeks ago, we went back to Cyprus, went back to Purnara to see what effect the recommendations of the committee had. That report will be agreed by the committee when it next meets in July and transmitted to the Cypriot authorities. The reports of the committee remain confidential unless the committee are invited by the country to publish the report.
So you have to wait for them to give you the authorizations?
Yes, we have to wait. However, there are currently 18 member states of the Council of Europe that have agreed to the automatic publication of CPT reports. That's a real positive in relation to cooperation. The principles in which the CPT works are the principles of cooperation and confidentiality. The findings of the committee remain confidential until the state party authorises that we can make public that report. And the publication of CPT reports is not only about setting out areas of concern, it's also about acknowledging good practice. And the publication of CPT reports allows other member states to for that good practice to be flagged to other member states, and for them to be able to consider whether that's something that actually might be a benefit for them also. The committee have already published the list of countries which will receive a periodic visit in 2026. There are 8 periodic visits have been announced. Ad hoc visits, which are visits that often have a focus on immigration detention, are most often only announced to countries around 1 week in advance of the visit. So it's not possible for us to share details of further visits that we have planned in relation to immigration detention matters at this time.
Of course. And so what are your next priorities? Is it shorter detentions or better conditions if they are longer detentions?
Detention should always be the last resort. It's disappointing, if I can be quite honest, to see new immigration detention facilities being built across Europe which resemble prisons rather than places of administrative detention. While member states, of course, might wish that persons be detained in order to confirm their identity, for example, their nationality, to confirm whether they have previously claimed asylum in an EU member state or indeed in another country. Such periods of detention really have to be as short as possible. And thereafter, for example, I don't believe there's any good reason for a blanket situation whereby persons are automatically detained pending the outcome of their asylum application.
And in addition, I would say we will continue to look at specific vulnerable categories of person
that you mentioned earlier. Yes.
Exactly, that we ensure that their treatment is both decent, but they're getting the proper referrals and specialist services that aren't always forthcoming, in that states are often resource constrained. And the first things to go are often access to psychiatrists or doctors, or these assessments usually slow down. So we'll continue to really prioritise their protection needs, children's protection needs, and people who have suffered from abuse.
Well, thank you, both of you, for coming on the podcast today, and good luck with all these.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this discussion and wish to explore more topics, be sure to check out our other episodes of Europe Explained. You can learn more about the Council of Europe and its initiatives at our website, www.coe.int. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and insights. You can find us on X, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram.